بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. O Canada, you received many warnings. You were told many times what will become of those who fight against the Islamic State. You watched as your allies in Europe and America had their bullets and bombs returned back to them. You saw bodies of the filthy French laying in their own streets. You saw explosions in Paris and Brussels, similar to the explosions they were dropping on the citizens of the Islamic State. You saw brave men and women respond to the call of jihad. You saw that each member of the coalition of crusaders was being punished for their aggression against the Muslims. Then perhaps you thought yourself safe from retaliation because you ran away from the battlefield? No, by Allah, you still have much to pay for. You still have a heavy debt which has to be paid. You still have Muslim blood on your hands, and for this we are thirsty for your blood. There's a fire burning in the chests of every Muslim, and this fire can be cooled only by the spilling of your blood. Your war in Islam is not the kind of crime we allow ourselves to dismiss, to forgive, or to forget, inshallah. You will pay for everything you ever brought against us. Whether you drop a bomb or fire a single bullet, we will hold you accountable for this, inshallah. Whether you spend millions in the war against Islam or you spend a single cent, we will hold you accountable, inshallah. Whether you creep an inch towards the lands of Islam or you step foot over its borders, we will hold you accountable, inshallah. You call yourselves peacekeepers on this earth, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already warned us against you. You're nothing but mischief makers, and all you do is spread oppression and corruption. So today is the day you experience what it's like to be targeted for your belief, inshallah. I give my pledge of allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, Amir al-Mu'mineen. He's called for jihad in the lands of the Crusaders, and I'm responding to this call.
Breaking news from the border. New details emerging right now on a foiled suicide bomb plot in Canada, where police killed the suspect. Dramatic operation. ABC's chief global affairs anchor Martha Raddatz has all the latest. Good morning, Martha.
Good morning, George. Canadian authorities believed the planned suicide attack on a major city in Canada was imminent. SWAT teams and the bomb squad swarmed a residence about an hour north of the U.S. border where 23-year-old Aaron Driver was hiding out, eventually killing him in a hail of bullets. Canadian television says Driver planned to use a homemade bomb to carry out the suicide mission in a public area with the goal, George, of creating mass casualties.
And Martha, he'd been on their radar.
He was known as an ISIS sympathizer who posted on social media, although there is no evidence yet that he was directed by the terror group, but he had been previously arrested. Police say he once published instructions for aspiring jihadists to reach Syria and referred to non-Muslims as enemies. George?
Thank goodness they
The
stopped him.
family of Aaron Driver says the young man is dead. He's a suspect police had been looking for after authorities received what they say was credible information about a possible homegrown terror attack here in Canada. Driver was a known ISIS supporter who had been arrested in the past, but in February, despite fears raised in court that he would support a terror group, he was released by a Winnipeg judge on a peace bond that said he had to live in Strathroy, Ontario. That rural community is where a dramatic police scene has unfolded this evening. RCMP officers and members of the Bond Squad blocked off a rural street, and neighbors say they heard loud noises. Now, CBC News has learned that Driver's family was told by the RCMP that Driver had detonated a device that injured himself and another person, and that Driver had another device that he was going to detonate, and that is why the RCMP shot him. The RCMP will hold a news conference tomorrow to answer more questions about this investigation. Tonight, though, we spoke with a security expert, and he says there will be big questions about peace bonds after this investigation.
Now, the problem is with peace bonds is you have to have enough evidence to lay charges. Peace bonds are not charges. They are basically restrictions on certain activities when the law enforcement has reasonable grounds to believe you're up to something.
Now, many government officials had already been put on alert after an internal memo was sent out warning of a possible lone wolf attack in a Canadian city with a goal of causing mass casualties. But, Rosie, a source tells me Canada's overall terror threat level has not been raised.
A terrorist attack thwarted. That's reason to cheer. I'm Brian Lilly with the Rebel.media. At RCMP headquarters behind me, the Mounties have wrapped up a news conference explaining what happened in Strathroy, Ontario, with now deceased jihadi 24-year-old Aaron Driver. Jennifer Strachan, who oversees the RCMP for Ontario, says that driver was inside his house. He was under surveillance when a cab pulled up. As officers moved in, he detonated a device. They don't know whether it was on his body or in a backpack, but that set off an explosion in the back of the taxi cab.
As he was exiting the residence very quickly, the emergency response team engaged as appropriately. And very split second, he got into the cab, something detonated. There will be an autopsy. It's not clear how Mr. Driver died. He was engaged with police. A firearm was deployed. But I can't confirm if there was a potentially shrapnel that he took in from the inside of the cab or whether it was the engagement with the police.
Strachan doesn't know whether it was police bullets or the bomb itself that killed him. That will be determined by an autopsy. The cab driver injured. Police saying it's good that they were able to apprehend this man as quickly as they did, because otherwise things could have gone much worse. They're still not saying what his intended target is, but we do know that they were able to identify driver after a tip-off from the FBI. 8:30 on Wednesday morning, the FBI called the RCMP to say they had a martyrdom video from someone they didn't know. It turned out to be driver, swearing vengeance on Canada for Canada's role in fighting against Muslims in Muslim lands. So that call about the video, some screenshots of it, and eventually the video itself, that all started at 8:30. The Mounties had driver identified by 11 a.m. and under surveillance. It was at 4 o'clock and shortly after 4 o'clock that the cab showed up at his house and the incident went down. There's still a lot that we don't know about this, but I did ask Deputy RCMP Commissioner Mike Cabana whether he thought mental illness was a factor in here, because every time there's a terrorist incident, that becomes the claim.
So all I can comment on is individuals such as Mr. Driver radicalized by various means. In the case of Mr. Driver, likely the internet played a significant role in his radicalization, but again, this is speculation on my part. Clearly, he was radicalized based on I.S.I.S propaganda, but in terms of his mental state, it's not something that, frankly, I'd be qualified to speak to.
Driver is someone who was under a peace bond since 2014. He's someone who had an ankle bracelet put on him. That was a restriction taken away by the court in February of 2016. It turns out that maybe he should have been wearing it. They're not sure how he was able to get the materials to develop his explosive device. They say there's still much that they don't know, that they'll learn over the coming days as they search his house, search his belongings, and try and piece together what exactly happened. But the bottom line is there was an incident, and the only person dead at the end of it is a jihadi. Close police work across borders and across the country turned out to be a good result.
Lauren Dawson is a terrorism expert. He's also the co-director of the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, and he joins me live from Waterloo. Really glad you could take the time, Lauren. How are things going for you today?
Well, pretty busy today
No
in terms
kidding.
of media.
And I'd like to get your thoughts, because your organization actually had contact with Aaron Driver. So how surprised are you by the news that he had let off one device, had another that he was going to explode perhaps, and that police shot him?
Well, we really were quite surprised when we started to figure this out last night, that it could likely be Aaron Driver. That's partially because, well, he definitely was an individual with very strong views, radical views, and ones that justifiably attracted the attention of the authorities. In our interview with him, which I can't say too much about because it was in the context of his legal case, the peace bond, but the overall impression we gained of him is that he wasn't necessarily violent, and he himself asserted that he wasn't a violent person. So we thought he was pretty much strongly in the camp of talk and support and holding strong views, but not actually himself likely to do anything.
So you were wrong.
Well, we were, but it's very hard in these circumstances to make these judgments. The research record overall shows that a very large number of people talk, radical ideas, and a very small percentage act on those ideas, and we've never been able to figure out very effectively exactly what the difference is, how people cross over into action. I suspect here, but it's just a suspicion, is that the peace bond itself may, in this case, have aggravated the circumstance. Now, that doesn't mean it shouldn't have been imposed. It was the only recourse the police had. But once he was isolated, then instead of moderating his views, it may have caused him to cling even more tenaciously to his views and pushed him further.
Because why? When somebody is under a peace bond, there are pretty strict conditions attached to that bond, right?
Well, the one thing that's clear is that this is not true of all individuals, but it's true of a certain clear percentage. He had definitely come from a personally troubled background. He was a young man who was fairly bright and articulate, but really struggling with a sense of who he was and what he was supposed to do in life. He had lots of issues he was struggling with, and it had lapses into problematic behavior throughout his life. And when he converted to Islam, it's clear that that had become the sort of new restructuring focus for his life. And he really was quite tenaciously hanging on to an extreme interpretation of Islam as a way of giving him focus and purpose in life. So he was very dependent on his online contacts with other people that shared his views. And having that online contact removed, I think maybe in his case, removed any kind of support system, and may have caused him to feel very isolated and, his back against a wall.
So what do you do then?
Well, this is where, regrettably, in Canada, unlike Germany, Denmark, Holland to some extent, and in the UK, we need to, if we put people in peace bonds, that's great, but we also need to put them into contact with individuals who are trained to be able to counsel them and assist them, right, and talk to them and attempt to move them away from their radical perspectives, to guide them towards expressing their intense religiosity in somewhat more constructive ways. Regrettably, in Canada, we have a few piecemeal efforts happening across the country, but so far we don't have any kind of concerted national effort in this regard. The Liberal governments are promising it, and I think, in all honesty, they're making very strong measures to bring it about, but it's not there yet. And we're several years behind other countries in that regard.
Final question for you, Lauren. What's the research show when it comes to radicalization of young people or people who are actually born in Canada? We do know there is so much interest in those who come to Canada from other countries and finger pointing, etc. But what does your research show about the Canadian-born radicalized individual?
Well, of course, all over the world, we're seeing people who are second-generation immigrants. So, I mean, they themselves were born in Canada, and that's certainly true for many of the prominent figures in Canada that have gone off and died fighting for ISIS in Syria. And then the other category that Aaron Driver fits in is the converts. And we have, of course, in Canada, we have Andre Poulin, we have John Maguire, we have a whole series, Damien Claremont, a whole series of quite prominent converts to Islam who have, gone the whole way in terms of their radicalization. They've managed to make their way to Syria, and they've died in suicide attacks or been killed in battle. Now, these individuals, all we can say in most cases is that it definitely is about them struggling to figure out some kind of, it's going to sound light saying this, but it really comes through in the research. Certain individuals just have a harder struggle with sort of basic existential issues. They're young and they really want to have an important role in life. They want to have a point and purpose, and they can't find it through our conventional means. Conventional teenage life just doesn't satisfy them, and they start this quest for something more dynamic. And today, if you go online, the people who are willing to give you an answer to those kinds of questions are disproportionately promoting these jihadist viewpoints.
Phoned him up to see how he was doing, and he hung up the phone on me. He said, "I don't want to be talking to you," and hung up the phone. It's been a tough relationship for it got worse the last couple of years. He was very withdrawn, always alone. He wouldn't socialize with us, even when he did live with us. He was very secretive. He wouldn't answer questions about what he was doing online. And we could hear the different chants and prayers. We could hear some of the conversations that were going on, or not conversations, but some of the podcasts that he was listening to when he was living with us, and I was trying to get information as to what he was listening to and why he was going in that direction. He's just a mixed-up kid that got in with the wrong group, and just to let people know that he was loved. He wasn't always bad, if you will.
And he wasn't always radicalized, wasn't even always Muslim. He was born Christian in Saskatchewan. He also lived in New Brunswick. He lived in Ontario and Alberta before he moved to Manitoba, Michael, in 2012.
You know, it's always so difficult because when anything like this happens, people are always asking the parents, how did this happen? How did this happen? And so oftentimes parents don't have the answer.
Yeah,
you know,
it's so hard. How do you answer that now?
Yeah, and you can't live your child's life. But what do we know about the past? Any indications as to when the turn might have happened?
Well, let's have a look at some key dates here, because there certainly are key dates that certain things happen that sort of points you in the direction that this is where things are now. By October 2014, that was the critical date that he caught the attention of I.S.I.S when he began tweeting support for the militant group ISIS under an alias. June 2015, that is when authorities were concerned that he would become involved in planning some sort of terrorist activity, and he was arrested on a peace bond. Then in February of 2016, although he was not facing criminal charges, Driver agreed to a peace bond to limit his activities. That required him to keep the peace, be on good behavior for a certain period of time. Now, after his arrest in 2015, Aaron Driver actually spoke to CBC News. He talked about what he described as a complicated relationship between Muslims and those living in the West, and expressed his views on some attacks that happened here on Canadian soil. Take a listen.
I don't think Muslims really belong in the West. Our ways of life aren't compatible. The truth is we can't practice our religion to the fullest extent here, living under Canadian laws or just Western laws in general. I mean, Parliament Hill, they were attacking uniformed soldiers. The brother who ran over the two soldiers previously was the same thing. These aren't attacks on, like malls or I don't know, like any kind of public place, like churches or anything like that. These are attacks on police officers, and these are attacks on soldiers. These are people who are part of the system. It's entirely different. It's not attacking like innocents, people who are just going about their daily lives.
So that was an interview done in 2015 with Aaron Driver. Chilling, isn't it, Michael, to hear his thoughts now, or then, what we know now. But clearly you can hear his ideological beliefs in what he was doing. These were not innocent people, as he said. And his father said that peace bond that we talked about, that when he was arrested, he wished it had been further. He wished that his son had been arrested because maybe he would have been able to get the help that he needed. He said he tried to understand the Quran, tried to understand the religion to try and help his son. But he said he's very sad, but not entirely surprised.
And of course, the difficulty again in this is that you hear a young man speaking for himself, certainly not speaking for all Muslims, and certainly not speaking for
and his
Islam.
father said that as well. He said, this isn't everyone, this is a troubled young man.
Takbir! Allahu Akbar! Takbir! Allahu Akbar! Takbir! Allahu Akbar!
We don't know how big it is. Any police officer that looks you in the eye and quotes you a number in any city is foolish.
When you don't find purpose and meaning in life, the only thing you look forward to is death.
How concerned are you that more kids will come out of the community in Calgary and join ISIS?
If we continue on this trajectory, you're festering an environment that is going to breed terrorists.
So, Damien's body...
His ISIS brothers buried him in Haritan.
Currently, I.S.I.S is aware of over 130 Canadians who are abroad in support of extremist activities, including approximately 30 in Syria alone.
I made hijrah to this land for one reason alone. I left comfort for one reason alone, for Allah Azza wa Jal. And inshallah, after Sham, after Iraq, after Jazeera, we are going for you, Barack Obama.
In September 2014, Vice News interviewed Farah Sheardon, a Somali Canadian who left Calgary to fight with the Islamic State.
So I.S.I.S interviewed you
about going to Syria, being a terrorist. You said, no, I'm not.
I can't believe how someone that has extremist terrorist ideologies was sitting in front of you and you didn't capture. The next time they saw me ripping up my passport.
Canada is exporting murder, and Calgary's a hotspot. Someone here knows how this is happening and may know who's next.
The Canadian media has emphatically labeled Calgary as a hotbed of terrorism. When I first heard the reports, I was shocked. How could this Western Canadian boomtown that's obsessed with hockey be fostering all this extremist thought? So we went to see what the reality is.
So we are in Calgary, Alberta, at the downtown 8th and 8th Masala. It's somewhat controversial because there were 5 guys who came from this masjid and went on to join ISIS. So we're here to talk to them and look into what it is about Calgary, this place specifically, that's leading towards radicalization and extremism. Assalamu alaikum.
No news organizations have ever been permitted to film inside the Masala, but the Imam, Naved Aziz, allowed us to attend his theology class.
Now, when you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where he talks about physiological needs, he talks about safety, he talks about love, and he talks about self-esteem, and he talks about self-actualization, what do you think is actually missing from Maslow's hierarchy of needs? What gives him ambition to stay alive? Purpose, exactly. What I believe is missing from Maslow's hierarchy of needs is purpose. From the Sharia perspective, that's the first thing that's being addressed. Because if you don't have a purpose to live, you don't have a purpose to continue, why would you want your physiological needs met? Why would you want safety? Why would you want everything else? All of that is dependent upon purpose.
After the session, we sat down with the Imam to talk about what he thought drove these young men to join the Islamic State.
So what was your reaction when you found out that these young guys that used to pray here left and went and joined ISIS?
The first 5, I didn't know them personally, nor did I have much interaction with them, but they had a reputation preceding them already, that they were known as the troublemakers. Whereas with Sheridan, I knew him even before he got radicalized in this sense. I remember I'd gone to Malaysia for like 3 weeks, and in those 3 weeks, when I wasn't here, that's when everything changed for him. And he went from this good guy who was dedicated to his faith and had a lot of potential to being someone that had become very closed-minded, very isolated, and didn't want to hear anything you had to say.
How could that happen so quickly?
I guess when you don't have a source of religious knowledge in person, you'll seek it online. What's available online is available to you 24 hours a day. And that's when they find these crazy radical preachers that are blow this up, blow that up, and all this crazy stuff.
It's a large Muslim community in Calgary, I think 80,000 approximately.
Yeah, for sure.
How did the community react to the news that there were 5 individuals who were from the Calgary Muslim community and they left to join ISIS?
For the most part, it was shock. People couldn't believe that people from our own community would go and do something like this. When you don't find purpose and meaning in life, the only thing you look forward to is death. And that's what I feel a lot of these young kids ended up finding. Again, it'll go down to social and psychological disorders, a fascination with death, a fascination with killing, of empowerment through oppression and things like that.
Look at how powerful the ISIS brand is. They've been so effective.
Right.
And even though they have small numbers, from your perspective, how does that make you feel in terms of what they're doing to the reputation of Islam?
For sure. It breaks your heart. It's how dare you, destroy the image of my faith with your, reprehensible actions.
The Imam stressed that 8th and 8th is in reality a moderate mosque. But because of the young men who prayed there and then went and joined I.S., it's now been given a reputation as a place of extremist thought. To get more perspective, we went to visit someone who knew one of these guys better than anyone else.
So we're about to meet with Christiane Boudreau. She is the mom of a young Canadian guy named Damien Claremont, who left here to go fight with ISIS. He was killed last year fighting in Aleppo. He was 22. Smiling in all the photos, happy.
But that's just it. He was loving, he was caring. This is the beginning of his depression era, and that's the only photo I have.
In his eyes. Your son Damien, I'm very interested in his story, how you think he was radicalized. Did you start seeing signs of it?
Well, Damien went through a period of depression in his teens and tried to take his own life day after his 17th birthday. Not long after he got out of the hospital and started reestablishing a life, the psychiatrist recommended that he not come home because he was afraid that he would get back in the same rut where he was sitting on the computer, he wasn't leaving the house ever. So he went off on his own. He got his own place. He started off with a group home and then got his own place. And then not long after that, he converted to Islam. And it was good. It was really good. He started bringing friends home again. He was still living on his own, but he would come over to visit. He was happy, calm, peaceful, and got along with everybody. Yeah.
And then what happened?
He started, you know, wandering to different mosques to find something more convenient. And shortly thereafter is when we started to see some changes within him.
Is that when he started going to 8th and 8th?
8th and 8th, yeah.
How did those changes manifest themselves?
No more friends came by. If somebody was picking him up, they'd pick him up around the corner. If he got a phone call on his phone, he wouldn't take it in the house. He would go outside. And he started becoming much more agitated. So he started challenging beliefs that were completely contradictory to what I raised him with, that he had never challenged before.
Is that him being radicalized or not yet?
Yep.
Did you have any warning, advance warning before he left? Or did you just wake up one day and he was gone?
No, he told us he was leaving, but he said he was going to Egypt to study.
Did he even go to Egypt, or he
No.
just said he was going to Egypt and he spent a year in Syria? Initially to join Al-Nusra Front, I think, and then when ISIS was formed or split off.
That's when he went with ISIS, and that's when we lost contact.
And so you were never able to, Damien's body, never able to recover it?
No, his I.S.I.S brothers buried him in Harrowtown.
Stories like Claremont's have fueled fears around radicalized youth throughout Canada. But it was 2 lone wolf attacks in October 2014, which killed Canadian soldiers in Ottawa and Quebec, that led the Harper government to introduce controversial anti-terror legislation known as Bill C-51, aiming to give unprecedented new powers to law enforcement.
What's to stop this bill from being used to spy on the government's political enemies?
Calgary's recently retired chief of police, Rick Hansen, believes Bill C-51 could help stop radicalized youth from leaving Canada to join the Islamic State.
How big of an issue is radicalization from the police department's perspective?
Well, we don't know how big it is. And any police officer that looks you in the eye and quotes you a number in any city, in this country or any other country, is foolish. Because after 40 years in policing, I know one thing for sure: we're not as smart as we think we are. You know, we don't know everything that's going on. So the number that's been talked about in Calgary has been as high as 30. There may be. I suspect that the number's probably higher than that.
What do you think is so attractive about ISIS that gets these kids to up and leave and go join?
Calgary's a city of opportunity, but not every kid growing up has the same opportunity. There's lots of money, lots of jobs. There's lots of support for the right people. And by what I mean by the right people is those that have access to money, that don't struggle in school. But we know there's lots of kids that struggle in school, that don't fit in. Those are the kids that are most vulnerable. That's why it's our job to start to build trust at the earliest opportunity and provide the counter message. Right now, there's not much countering the ISIS message. They're masters at creating videos that appeal to those young men in particular who are looking to fit in somewhere.
Does Bill C-51 help the police do their job to stop kids from joining ISIS?
I think what C-51 does is provides additional powers that allow the authorities, the federal authorities, to intervene and prevent. If you are investigating someone who is obviously articulated their intention to go over there and fight for a terrorist organization, do you let them leave the country? Because then you're exporting terrorism. You've got to have the ability to not allow that to happen. So I think C-51 helps define what that looks like and what can be done.
Is there a concern, though, that it does overstep the boundaries of, the freedoms that exist in the Canadian Constitution?
Well, everything about policing and everything in a democratic society is trying to walk a fine line between protecting those same democratic rights and those same freedoms for the majority without going too far the other way, where you're stepping too much on people's rights.
Despite the potential for C-51 to protect Canada at large, many worry about how it will impact the Muslim community and that it could foster further Islamophobia. Mohammed Al-Rafi is a social worker who deals with at-risk youth, who could be prime targets under C-51.
Oh, this is Mohammed, his counselor.
When we arrived at his house, he was on the phone with a corrections officer discussing a teenager who was soon to be released from juvenile detention.
The crime that he had committed is something that if anybody else had done it, who wasn't some young, recent Iraqi youth, they wouldn't have gotten any time for it. They would have gotten a slap on the wrist. He was picked up for car prowling, which all it means is walking by car doors and, looking into windows.
See if there's anything to steal.
Exactly. No priors and breaking into cars or stealing or anything like that. Got a call home. Mom said, I'm not taking him home. Like, he's too much trouble. Being in there, other youth target him, so he's got a mouth on him. He has to, because he has to be able to defend himself. It's hard for him to make friends and alliances in there, not being from here, not fully understanding the culture. And it's quite easy for him to get segregated and isolated. When he comes out, it's definitely going to be more of that us versus them thinking, which is what segregates people and isolates communities.
Al-Rafi believes there are real issues of segregation and further alienation for the Muslim community in Calgary. You're a social worker, you've been working with high-risk youth. Take us into the heads of, these kids who have been radicalized and left Calgary to join ISIS.
You're here, you're alone, you're not fitting into groups. Maybe your parents are divorced, maybe you're living in poverty, maybe you have a crappy life, you have a crappy job. Maybe you have a great job and a great education, but you still don't feel like you're part of the society. Somebody takes advantage of you and comes and tells you, all that oppression you've been seeing, you've been praying and saying you wanted to help somebody? What if I told you that you would be part of this brotherhood where you come and you're one of us and you're protected and we'll fly you out overseas. You'll have money and you'll have women and you'll have weapons and you'll be able to become, the big boss. If I was somebody with a mental disorder, even if I wasn't a Muslim, I'd say, oh, that seems like it's going to be pretty exciting.
Let's talk about Bill C-51.
Yeah.
Do you think that's going to help the police to stop kids from going over and joining ISIS?
Language and the types of laws that are being passed by the government, particularly things like laws like C-51, when youth see that, all they're thinking about, am I going to get red flagged? Is CSIS going to be following me? Is RCMP going to be following me? As long as people are afraid and youth are afraid to speak up and have this discussion, outside people are going to think that we have something to hide. And if they don't think it on their own, somebody's going to frame it that way.
How concerned are you that more kids will come out of the community in Calgary and join ISIS?
If we continue on this trajectory with the government putting out segregating language and isolating language and provocative language, not just towards our community, but which is also going to have mainstream Canadians put up barriers against Muslims and then have Muslims put up barriers to box themselves in because they're afraid to be part of that general society, you're festering an environment that is going to breed terrorists.
What's your take on the view that Bill C-51 can further alienate minority communities, can make them feel targeted, and potentially help with the radicalization process?
That's a real fear. Yeah, and I know it's a real fear because I know that many people in the diverse communities feel that way. And there will be those that criticize it and say it's gone too far, but I think one has to look at what's best for the majority of people in the country and how best do you protect them. And I think there's a lot of parents that would say, I wish somebody would have stopped my son before they went over there and he died.
Though Calgary is known to have exported a number of jihadis who joined the Islamic State, men and women from cities across Canada have done the same. It's hard to say whether or not Calgary is a hotbed for terrorism. But what we did discover is that there's a high level of paranoia and fear in the Muslim community, and that preemptive government measures like Bill C-51 are only going to make things worse. It's potentially a perfect storm, creating an environment that actually could radicalize the youth.
Apologists for the jihadis. I'm Brian Lilly with the Rebel.media. It happens every time there's a terrorist incident in this country. Someone will step forward and say, this had nothing to do with Islam. This was a mental health issue. This person wasn't actually a Muslim. They weren't a true one. It's already happening now. We're going to see more of it. While I was in the middle of the RCMP news conference, this woman from Montreal, Laura Dravland, was writing to me saying, note, driver, not Muslim, not from a Muslim country, and not a refugee. Just saying. No one ever said this was an attack carried out by refugees. And yes, driver was born and raised in Canada, so not from a Muslim country, but he was in fact a Muslim convert, someone that not only embraced the religion of Islam, but then went further and embraced the ISIS death cult based on a Wahhabist, Salafist theology that wants to have the rest of the world submit to their ways. Even other Muslims, not safe. We've talked about this before, but for some reason, people are always determined to say that this has nothing to do with Islam, even as the people carrying out the attacks or attempting to will state clearly that that's what they view it as.
Oh Canada, you've received many warnings. You're told many times what would become of those who fight against the Islamic State. I give my pledge of allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, Amir al-Mu'mineen. He's called for jihad in the lands of the Crusaders, and I'm responding to his call.
We've got to be able to take these people at their word. We've also got to be able to understand their theology, their ideology, what's driving this. If we can't, then how do we combat the radicalization that, as experts I've spoken with have told me, does not happen online? It normally starts with someone in person. That person may introduce you to the ideas and then direct you towards websites. But there are people inside this country. They may be small in number, but they are out there recruiting that want to introduce young men from whatever background to this violent ideology. We've got to be able to understand that. We also have to be able to stop with this notion that every terrorist incident is a mental health issue. Is it sometimes? I'm sure it is. But I asked the RCMP Deputy Commissioner, Mike Cabana, about that very issue, and he said he's in no position to comment on Aaron Driver's mental state. The RCMP's been in contact with this man for well over 2 years now. They have never at any point said this was a man who was mentally ill, but he was clearly someone that wanted to do violence to Canada. Being able to stop these sorts of things takes a lot of different factors to come into play, including the cooperation that we saw between police forces across Canada and across the U.S. border. But it also includes opening up your eyes to what the threat is and who is behind it.
Well, there is a war at the moment between the West and Islam. And the war goes back to very, very deep historical roots. The purpose of the war on the Islamic side, at least according to the reports of their leaders, is very simple. So let's listen to an ISIS video being read by a captive.
For the Islamic State, it's a win-win situation. If these executions force public outcry or a policy change, that is a huge victory. And if they only goad our governments into dropping more bombs and spending millions more dollars, making our countries weaker in the process, then that is a victory too. I have yet to see David Cameron's reaction to the killing of David Haines, but I'm sure it'll be along the lines of, Britain is shocked and appalled at this brutal act, and we will not rest until the Islamic State is defeated and those guilty of his murder are brought to justice.
This is a despicable and appalling murder of an innocent aid worker. It is an act of pure evil. My heart goes out to the family of David Haines, who have shown extraordinary courage and fortitude throughout this ordeal. The Prime Minister ended his statement saying, "We will do everything in our power to hunt down these murderers and ensure they face justice, however long it takes."
So there you have it. In committing attacks against Western countries, such as 9/11 and so on, in putting forward these repulsive medieval beheading videos, the goal of these extremists is twofold, and you can't really lose either way. Number one is to cause a withdrawal of Western military power from Muslim countries. Number two, of course, is if that fails, to continue to provoke the Western powers into escalating their violence against the Islamic countries until such time as the Western countries run out of money and thus withdraw their troops from Islamic countries, withdraw their military influence. This has a long history. It's so important to understand the both sides in a conflict really need to be understood. And of course, most people in the West, which we'll get to in a second, have a good understanding of the Western position. On the Islamic or the Muslim position, the Muslims, of course, have been ruled and divided and handed out like party favors among the Western powers for certainly since the early parts of the last century. And they have seen two significant waves, I guess three significant waves of imperial withdrawal. The first is after the First World War, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled, and this brought some relative short-term freedom to the Islamic countries, which were then carved up by the Western colonial powers, the victorious powers in the First World War. At the end of the Second World War, the British Empire collapsed as a result, of course, of the fact that England had run out of gold and was fundamentally broke, and therefore collapsed its empire, which was always a money-losing proposition as a whole. It only benefited a few select members of society. It was at the expense of the society as a whole. The third wave, of course, is the Mujahideen, who were trained by the CIA to fight against the Russians in the Afghani war after the Russian invasion and occupation, and then continue to wage a war of attrition against the Russians, and as a result, the Russian Empire collapsed and the Russians withdrew, and so on. And so now, of course, the dominant presence in the Middle East is America, and to a smaller degree Britain, and of course, through sales of arms and weaponry, Israel. Now, they're not going to get Israel to withdraw, but they can focus on bankrupting the Western powers through this continued war of attrition. It's far more expensive to invade than it is to wage a war of attrition, and therefore, in the long run, the invading power always runs out of money and has to withdraw. So this is the basic reality of the conflict, and it may be not coincidental that as the imperial powers withdraw from the conflict, specific actions are taken to provoking them into re-engaging. So Canada ended its mission in Afghanistan in March of this year. So maybe there's a reason to goad Canada into re-engaging. America, of course, scaled back its involvement in Iraq. And so now they're back in Iraq, and the goal is to get them to re-engage. You have to keep, if you are waging this war of attrition against an occupying force, you have to keep them engaging until you bleed the treasury dry. Well, of course, the American treasury is long dry, as is most of the Western treasuries, because they're off the gold standard. But the reality is there's so much debt that until you simply can't pay the soldiers anymore, until you simply run out of money to fund your imperialistic fantasies, you continue to get the Western powers to re-engage. And that, of course, is the purpose. In Canada, of course, the tragedy is going to be that there is going to be significant if it turns out that the shooters are Islamic or radicalized or Muslim or something like that. And we, in fact, will hold this video until this determination is made. And we're going to assume that it is and release it when this information comes out. The tragedy is going to be that there's going to be a renewed call for let's go get these guys, let's go bring these killers to justice, let's go do this, let's go do that. And the only thing that will happen is further debt and erosion of civil liberties in the relatively formally free countries in the West. This is the tragic outcome of this. Now, there will, of course, be massive politically correct cries to not succumb to what is called Islamophobia. You always have to worry and be very, very skeptical when people put forward arguments with the word phobia or gate in them, Gamergate. And so phobia, of course, is one of these irrational words that denotes, the rational word denoting irrational perspectives. And to what degree is it irrational to have concerns about an Islamic or Muslim population in your country? Well, around a third of young British Muslims favor killing in the name of Islam, according to a survey released by WikiLeaks, publication of U.S. diplomatic cables. A U.S. diplomatic cable from January 2009 quoted a poll by the Center for Social Cohesion as saying 54% wanted a Muslim party to represent their worldview in Parliament and 40% want Muslims in the UK to be under Sharia law. 12% of young Muslims in Britain believe that suicide attacks against civilians in Britain can be justified. 1 in 4, 25% of Muslims support suicide attacks against British troops. From 2007, 26% of younger Muslims in America believe suicide bombings are justified. 35% in Britain, 42% in France, 22% in Germany, and 29% in Spain. 25% of British Muslims disagree that a Muslim has the obligation or an obligation to report terrorists to police. 1 in 5 Muslim students in Britain would not report a fellow Muslim for planning a terror attack. 68% of British Muslims support the arrest and prosecution of anyone who insults Islam. As was recently quoted in the Bill Maher show, 78% of British Muslims support the arrest and prosecution of the newspapers in Europe which published Mohammedan cartoons. 35% of Canadian Muslims refuse to repudiate Al-Qaeda. 62% of Muslims want Sharia law in Canada, and 15% say make it mandatory. So that's not particularly compatible with the multi-millennia development of the separation of church and state and freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and so on, that has literally on the bodies of tens of millions of Westerners been built as an edifice that is one of the great glories of human civilization. It really is astonishing. This is not a tiny group of radicalized Muslims. There is significant support, 25%, 35%, 45%, depending on which questions you ask and what you measure, significant support for radical destructive terrorism in the Islamic community in the West. And this is something which cannot be sidestepped. And therefore, it is not fair to say that it is merely Islamophobia that has people having concerns about these communities in the West.
Converted to Islam started off as a Muslim apologetics channel. Ismail, the guy who runs it, was a Muslim convert for 16 years. A few months ago, out of nowhere, he posted a video saying that he could no longer defend Islam and that he's going to show Muslims why they shouldn't be dying for Allah. What's interesting is that the things that began bothering him about Islam are the same things many critics of Islam keep saying about Islam. The difference is that when I say something about the Quran or Muhammad, Muslims have their standard cop-out. Oh, he's just saying this because he's an Islamophobe, not because he actually has a problem with Muhammad telling his followers it's okay to rape their female captives. But they can't really use that excuse with Ismail because he was a Muslim and an apologist when he started wrestling with these issues. So it's really powerful when he's pointing out problems with Muhammad and the Quran and quoting the Muslim sources in Arabic and English. And you can tell from the death threats he's getting that Muslims are terrified of the impact he's going to have. Just to be clear, he didn't ask me for any sort of recommendation. I'm recommending his site because he's been posting some devastating videos. If you haven't seen any of them yet, a great place to start would be his video about why he left Islam. Very powerful, and I'm extremely excited to see what Ismail is going to do in the coming months and years. So check out his channel and be sure to subscribe.
Hi, many of you have seen my recent video where I shared some examples of Islamic death threats made against me. Just to keep you updated, here are some more examples of my recent direct or indirect Islamic death threats. Islam, my life forever, Allah willing, very graphically says, this is how he will get his head split in half, by making this videos. Muhammad Mo suggests a different method of execution, saying, the liar is at it again. I will celebrate into the night, the day that you get run over by a car, you filthy American CIA dog. Malik Islam, speaking about me and other apostates, says, so killing them by law becomes justified as they become shayateen, or devils for the people. Ali shares his thoughts by saying, I'm a Muslim and I don't like you. I'm gonna kill you with a knife. And lastly, in a weblog which discusses my recent apostasy from Islam, we find the following quote. Nadir says, There should be torture for everyone who represents Islam in a wrong way. Let's not compromise. Stand for killing the apostates. Look, as you have seen in my videos, I never attack Muhammad or Muslims. I simply read Islamic sources and then ask Muslims questions. And because of that, a number of Muslims want me dead. This disturbing truth has led many of you to conclude that Islam is not a religion of peace. Rather, it's a death cult which seeks to kill anyone who disagrees with it. However, there are other Muslims who highly doubt these Islamic death threats have any serious intent behind them, so they criticize me for displaying the death threats as a method of seeking attention, or propaganda, or self-promotion. Well, for you critical Muslims out there, I would like to inform you that the popular UK-based Islamic scholar Abdurrahman Dimashqiya apparently thinks these Islamic death threats are serious, because he made a video advising Muslims not to kill me. In his video titled, A Call of Advice to the Apostate Ismail Abu Adam, he gives at least 3 reasons why Muslims shouldn't kill me. He clearly has a good memory because in the first minute of his video he remembers meeting me. Yes, Sheikh, I am that British Muslim convert that you met some 15 years ago. Anyway, at 33 minutes until the end of the video, the Sheikh gives the following reasons for not killing me. Number 1. He said Muslims should be trying to help apostates to remove their doubts. Number 2, if you are in a non-Muslim country where Islam is weak, by killing an apostate you are making Islam weaker in that area or country, because the non-Muslim majority will turn against Islam even more. And number 3, even if you live in a Muslim country, you, the average Muslim, cannot kill an apostate. That decision can only be taken by an Islamic court, which is advised by Muslim scholars. There must also be an imam or leader in that Muslim country for all the Muslims. The implication here is, after going through a legal process in a Muslim country, I would in fact be killed as an apostate. Now, I don't know whether the Sheikh is genuinely concerned about my personal safety, or if he is only concerned about not making Islam weaker in non-Muslim countries. The point is, I'm not seeking attention or propaganda or self-promotion by displaying these Islamic death threats, because, as you have seen, even this Muslim scholar takes the death threats seriously. Thank you for watching.
What are your beliefs?
Well, I mean, I'm a Muslim, and I believe everything that comes along with that. I believe that I don't think Muslims really belong in the West. Our ways of life aren't compatible. The truth is we can't practice our religion to the fullest extent here, living under, Canadian laws or just Western laws in general.